Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. Welcome to this special episode of the Justice for All Now show. This is being broadcast on Kashmir Solidarity Day. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and today we shine a light on the ongoing human rights violations in Kashmir, as documented in the latest biannual report by Justice for All. As we gather here on this day that we commemorate every year, Kashmir Solidarity Day, we turn our focus to some heart wrenching struggles faced by the Kashmiri people under the Indian occupation. And this is not new. For over 70 years, the people of Kashmir have fought for their right to self determination. But their fight has been met with relentless violence, oppression, and cultural erasure. The situation, however, has only worsened since the revocation of Article 370 in 2019, which further entrenched the Indian state's control over the region. In the last few months alone, we've witnessed an alarming rise in military violence. In December 2024, just last month, four innocent bystanders, innocent laborers in Kishtwar district were subjected to horrific torture by the Indian army, beaten so badly that they could no longer walk or speak. This is not an isolated case, but part of a wider pattern of human rights violations, including landmine injuries, arbitrary detentions, and a growing climate of fear that silences dissent, that silences media, that basically has no coverage from anywhere on international media. Economically, Kashmiris are being dispossessed at an unprecedented scale. In July 2024, large tracts of Kashmiri land were handed over to the Indian Army, escalating militarization into civilian areas. And meanwhile, large industrial development projects backed by outside investors continue to marginalize local communities, leaving Kashmiris displaced from their own land and livelihoods. But the assault on Kashmir is not just physical, it's cultural. Authorities in Kashmir are systematically erasing the region's rich heritage. Just last month, the government removed the chapter on Sheikh Nuruddin Wali, a revered Sufi saint, from school textbooks, a direct attack on the Kashmiri Muslim identity. Across the region, streets, schools, and landmarks are being renamed to honor Indian military figures, erasing the very essence of Kashmiri culture and life. And perhaps most shocking of all, religious and political leaders who advocate for freedom and justice, like Mirwais Omar Farooq, continue to be detained and silenced. In December 2024 alone, he was placed under house arrest 3 times, preventing him from delivering prayers at Srinagar's Jame Masjid, a sacred act of spiritual leadership. I mean, just being not being able to pray the Jum'ah Salah, and this being one of the most prominent scholars of the land. So, this ongoing repression in Kashmir cannot be ignored. It's a systematic campaign to erase the Kashmiri identity, crush their aspirations of self determination, and impose a future under occupation, as has been for the past 70 years. But despite all of this, we know that the people of Kashmir continue to resist, and their struggle for justice and freedom remains as urgent as ever. Today, we are going to be discussing the findings from Justice for All's report on the situation in Kashmir, especially focusing on July to December 2024. And Alhamdulillah, I have to say, we have such deep connections to the people on the ground that we are able to share, and they are so brave that they are able to share what is happening on in the ground despite such repression and and despite just attacks on their lives and their livelihoods. To discuss and help us understand these very, very critical issues, I'm joined by the report's author, Ahmed bin Qasim, who has been deeply involved in documenting and analyzing the human rights violations in the region. He is a directly impacted person whose own family has been a victim of the Indian regime. So, welcome, Ahmed. How are you doing? I hope you are well and healthy in this month of Shaban, inshallah.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you so much for having me with you today. And Alhamdulillah, I mean, it's very important that Kashmir is brought into conversation because it's one of those causes that I often say that it's at the margin of the margins, which is to say that even when we speak of the oppressed people and the oppressed populations all around the world, even within that discourse, Kashmir occupies this very small place at the edge. So the fact that Justice for All has been regularly and routinely talking about Kashmir and at every space reminding people that Kashmir is the case of one of world's most prolonged military occupations. So we're not just talking about something that is, it's just started. It started in 2014 or in 2019 after the abrogation of Kashmir's nominal autonomy by the Hindu nationalist BJP government. No, this has been going on for 70 years. And what happens with occupations that go on for so long is that after a certain point of time, people tend to become desensitized because it's been going on for long. It's not new. There's nothing new about it. We have been hearing about Kashmiris suffering for 70 years, so it almost becomes normalized. Kashmir and being oppressed almost they become synonymous. So it does not evoke that reaction of urgency, so to speak. So yeah, I'm happy to be here and to talk about this report with you.
So, to begin with, could you provide us with an overview of the key findings of this report on the ongoing struggle? What has changed in the past 6 months? What have you discovered that hasn't been really reported on?
So, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that if you look at the last report that Justice for All kind of put forth, called Peace of a Graveyard, the idea of which was that the Indian state has been constantly promulgating this idea that all is well in Kashmir, that everything is normal, and it's there's silence in Kashmir. So by silence they mean that you don't have any so to speak conflict going on. And it is true in a way that there is a silence in Kashmir, and that, as we said, is the silence of a graveyard. It's a silence that is essentially built on the dead bodies of Kashmiris and at the expense of all this repression that we are trying to bring forward. And so, this report is, if you look at this report after you look at the previous report, there are going to be some continuities because there are certain patterns that the Indian state that are part of India's military occupation of Kashmir. So, for example, arbitrary detention or incarceration. This carcerality is part of India's rule in Kashmir. It cannot survive without it. So, one thing that I would mention here is that because of the Palestinian experience, because of the images and the stories that we see emerging from Gaza right now, you would see many Indians saying that, look, Kashmir is not Gaza.
Mm.
There aren't any buildings, you don't see airstrikes and all of that. So, what are you talking about? What occupation are you talking about? And usually, people tend to buy into this idea that, it's not that bad, which is true. I mean, there's no comparison as of now. But what is missed usually is this whole um, range of human rights violations that are obfuscated and even invisibilized. So the fact that the Indian state has to detain, as of now, thousands of Kashmiris, and not just detain them, but to send them to prisons all across India and to not even keep them in Kashmir so that their families could visit them, tells you that this so called normalcy that the Indian state is talking about comes at a certain cost, which means that the Indian state requires this oppression, requires these human rights violations in order to maintain its rule in Kashmir. And if it were to give up on this violence, if it were to give up on these mechanisms of repression, then it would not be able to survive for a day in Kashmir, because the natural aspiration of the Kashmiri people is that they should be free and they should have their right to self determination. So, when you speak of the continuities and discontinuities, that we can kind of make a comparison between the last 6 months and these 6 months. So, you have certain continuities like arbitrary detention. You have continued detention of Mirwais Umar Farooq, who is the kind of chief preacher among Muslims in Kashmir. So the main mosque in Kashmir Valley, Jamia Masjid, he is the leader of that mosque, the imam of that mosque, and he is not. You said 3 Fridays, but for example, in the month of December, you had 4 Fridays, and he was put in detention for all of those 4 Fridays, and he was not allowed to leave his house, and he was not allowed to lead the people in prayer. And what's very interesting is that even on some Fridays where he was allowed to go to the mosque, he said certain things. For example, in one of the Friday khutbahs, he called for the release of Kashmiri political prisoners. And afterwards, the next Friday, he was not allowed to leave his house and to deliver the khutbah. And then, in one of his own statements, he said that I am not being allowed to leave my house because I spoke for the political prisoners, for the prisoners of conscience in my last khutbah. So, the Indian state effectively is telling Mirwais and the religious leaders and the imams that the only way you can have your members and the only way you can actually go to your mosques is if you do not talk about the oppression that we are inflicting on the population. So basically, what is the point of Jummah, for example? What is the point of Friday? It is for the Muslim community to gather and talk about the things that are pressing for them. So the Indian state is telling them, no, you can talk about anything, but not what is most existentially important for you, which is the occupation. So that is, even if there is, some people are saying, look, people are going to mosques in Kashmir. They're going to mosques only if they don't talk about things that actually matter. The moment they talk about them, the gates of mosque are shut. And that is something that we see. And certain other patterns have also continued. For example, economic dispossession. Any Kashmiri who is associated with the Kashmiri self determination movement. Their properties have been confiscated, as we have documented in these reports, and they have been confiscated under a regime of so called legality, certain laws like UAPA, for example, which allows the Indian state to confiscate any property of an individual who they believe is a threat to India's national sovereignty or its so called territorial integrity. Now, these categories like yeah.
Ahmed, this was one of the most alarming aspects of the report, because the pace that economic dispossession um, is at is so high and so fast. The job losses, the land grabs. So I really want you to dig deeper into and share more about these economic violations because they impact the daily lives of Kashmiris because and it's a new form of violations compared to previous years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for example, as I said, the occupation is very old, but the idea of seizing properties of Kashmiris who are associated with the freedom struggle does not have a long history in Kashmir. So people used to be detained, but they used to have their homes and they used to have their houses and their families used to live there. But now the Indian state, what they want is basically, and I always say this, is they want Kashmiris to choose between their economic survival or their survival in general and the freedom struggle. So that's what this section of the report really makes clear. We talk about the job losses, right? Kashmiri teachers are being suspended because they did a Facebook post, for example, or because they are said to have sympathies. You know, the kind of language that the Indian state uses, that they have sympathies for the freedom struggle. Obviously, they don't call it freedom struggle, they call it sedition or they call it separatism. This is the state's language, but they say they have sympathy. So what's ridiculous is that what exactly is your kind of calculator through which you determine who has sympathies for what? So the law really is making a judgment based off on what is inside your mind or inside your heart. So you have a very kind of textbook Orwellian state that punishes people for effectively thought crimes.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you have these disposition, and what's very interesting, and this is something that is mentioned in the report, is that not only is the Indian state going after Kashmiris who are living in Kashmir, but Kashmiris who are in exile, who have left Kashmir because of state's repression, because of the fact that they were part of the movement and they had to leave Kashmir. 4,212 properties of Kashmiris who are not in Kashmir right now and are living in exile have also been blacklisted so that they cannot return back, and their families have been dispossessed of their properties. So this oppression has two faces. So you are oppressing the people who are outside, obviously, by denying them the right to return, by stealing effectively their properties from them. Because let's just call it what it is. It's not. These are sophisticated words, right? Confiscating and attaching, or so it's stealing. The Indian state is stealing the property of Kashmiri people. So it's oppressing those people who are already living a life of exile, but it's also psychologically tormenting them because their families are still in Kashmir. So now the idea that your families could be rendered homeless and they could be deprived of the properties they have is something obviously that adds to the oppression and the feeling of persecution that these people have outside. So you have people whose properties are being seized for a wide variety of reasons. Some are being deprived of their properties because it is said that they have sympathy. Some are being deprived because it is said that they gave shelter in their house to people who are part of the movement. Some are being deprived of their properties because it is said that they gave food to the people in their house who are part of the movement. So the idea really here is that every Kashmiri is either part of the movement and thereby the Indian state punishes them, or is potentially by association part of the movement, right? So either you yourself did something, or you assisted someone who did something, or you have sympathies for someone who did something. So that's why I say this often, is that the only good Kashmiri for the Indian state is a dead Kashmiri. And that is how it is, that you can never be a Kashmiri who believes in the dignity of your people and yet would not receive backlash for that from the Indian state. So this is something that the section makes very clear.
So this would actually even impact the daily lives in the sense of you have relatives, you have friends, inviting them over just for tea or dinner or a gathering. Someone passed away, so everything is criminalized. Every act of interaction, community interaction, is essentially criminalized because of the potential, or because that person that you invited may thought have, as you said, thought crimes about subhanallah. And this is sort of moving towards, I feel like the Indian regime is learning from the Chinese regime, where the sort of uh, oppression that is put upon the Uyghur people is the same, the similar, like we'll detain you and take you into mainland, and so you can be far away from your people, and that way we're, cleansing the land of you. Or we make just daily life, that is just the way you live, criminalized, so that you need to be put away, and will punish you by taking away your land, subhanallah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we see this in the you rightfully compared it to the Uyghur people. I mean, all of the Kashmiri prisoners who are taken to prison, most of them are not kept in Kashmir, so they're sent to prisons thousands of miles away from their homes. So what this does is, first of all, it deprives the people of their presence, and this is something that people don't talk about much. Is that imprisonment is not just for the person who is being imprisoned. you're also depriving the people of the guidance of these people who actually were the forerunners of the Kashmiri self determination movement. So these people are being sent to prisons across India, and it doesn't stop there. Their families are intimidated, their fathers are intimidated, their sisters are called to the camps of army and subjected to different degrees of harassment. So I think it's very important, therefore, to realize that these are like webs of oppression. So when one person is imprisoned, it's not just that person who is kind of bearing the brunt of it. And you mentioned thought crimes. We have one of the cases that we have kind of documented in this report of a lawyer called Mia Qayyum. Fascinating. He was a lawyer for political prisoners, right? So he used to fight the cases to get political prisoners out, and right now he is a political prisoner for being a lawyer for political prisoners. And this particular person, he was released on bail recently for a very brief period. And but this time around, when he petitioned for his release, the judge said that we can't release him because we feel that his heart has not changed yet. So, I mean, these are the kinds of. This is a judge. We're not talking about the state lawyer. We're talking about the judge who effectively acts as the state lawyer, as you will see once you read the report in the cases of Kashmiri political prisoners, but generally wherever the law is used to kind of legitimize oppression.
So we'll take a break now, and we'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We've been discussing the Justice for All biannual human rights report on Kashmir with its author, Ahmed bin Qasim. Ahmed, the report also sheds much light on severe restrictions on religious freedoms in Kashmir. And this is not a topic that gets enough attention. So, would I'd like for you to share your thoughts on the significance of these specific actions we've discussed against the religious leaders like Mirwais Umar Farooq. But what are some other findings in regards to religious freedom that you have discovered in the process?
I mean, if you read the report and also the previous report, and generally if you kind of follow the, I mean, there's no news coming out of Kashmir really, but if you speak to Kashmiris, so there are two forms of oppression when it comes to religious freedoms, especially or religion, that the people of Kashmir are experiencing. The first is, as I said, that they're simply not being allowed to practice their religion in certain ways. So, for example, people are not allowed to congregate for the sake of Salat, for the sake of a Jummah, or in Ramadan, for example. And as Ramadan is about to come, we're going to see this. And this is a pattern every single year that on the most important days of Ramadan, when it comes to, for example, the last nights, odd nights in Ramadan, or the nights of the night of Qadr, all of these nights, the main mosques are not allowed to stay open. And if they are allowed to stay open, then the imams are not allowed to go to the mosque. And what is very interesting, and this is the way in which the kind of the stories of oppression are connected, is that in the previous Ramadan, one of the reasons why the people were not allowed to congregate for the Jummah in the Jamia Masjid was because of Gaza. And this was explicitly mentioned by the chief police officer of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. He said that we fear that some elements, and these are his words, some elements are going to use the prayer for Palestine in order to create anti national sentiment. So basically, what he was saying is that if people were to pray for Palestine, that might turn into a protest against India simultaneously, because India and Israel really are brothers in arms and oppression, and the opposite of it is true for Kashmiris and Palestinians, which is that they are brothers as oppressed people who are resisting. So when it comes to religious freedoms, especially, so for example, this is not just hypothetical. In this particular report, we speak of the Muharram procession. For example, there's a Shia community, Shia Muslim community in Kashmir, who had their Muharram procession, and during that Muharram procession, obviously, Muharram for these people uh, exemplifies the story of resisting oppression, right? That's how they imagine it. That's what its reality is for people. And during that procession, people also spoke of Palestine. And
Mhm.
afterwards, after the procession, tens and tens of mourners were arrested and subjected to illegal detention, because that's, as I said in the beginning, the Indian state is telling Kashmiris that either you don't get to practice your religion, or if we do allow you out of this kind of, if I can say, colonial benevolence, if we allow you to practice your religion, then you have to do it the way we want you to do it. You can't talk about these things in these processions. And that is something very important. And then there are many other ways in which religious oppression happens. So, for example, when it comes to prisoners, and this doesn't even get reported, the Kashmiri Muslim prisoners who are in prisons across India, in different prisons, you have things like the Indian state installing uh, Hindu idols in their wards, despite the fact that there are no Hindu prisoners in their wards, just Muslims. And the Indian state playing Hindu hymns in their wards on loudspeakers. So, why is this being done? Them not allowing them to listen to adhan, them not allowing them to congregate for prayer. So you have things that happen out in the public, as we mentioned in this report, and then you also have things that are happening at a very kind of discrete level in prisons, where Muslims are being subjected to oppression within prison for being Muslim. So religious freedoms violations is something that is very essential to India's occupation in Kashmir. And you just have to look at one particular thing here, is that while Kashmiri Muslims are not being allowed to congregate and do, basically practice their Islam freely, at the same time, the Indian state to different Hindu yatras and pilgrimages, where Hindu pilgrims come from all across India to certain Hindu religious places in Kashmir. And these particular yatras and pilgrimages, when they happen, the roads are shut for Kashmiri Muslims. They are not allowed to leave their houses. They're not allowed to go to markets. They're not. I spoke to somebody in Kashmir who told me that he lives on this side of the road, and on the other side of the road is the mosque. But because there was this Hindu pilgrimage, for 1 week, entirety of 1 week, they were not allowed to cross the road because constant convoys were passing on this road that were carrying these pilgrims. So what's very clear is that you have, on the one hand, the state suppressing the right of Kashmiri Muslims to be Muslim, while
Mhm.
also at the same time there being the state sanctioned support for other communities that the Hindu nationalist or the Hindutva ideology sees as the only religion that gets to be free in India, which is those who subscribe to the ideology of Hindutva. And these, yatras or these pilgrimages, they are not religious pilgrimages in that they're not divorced from the Hindu nationalist ideology as we see it right now. So all of these yatras are projected by the Indian state or by the Hindutva ideologues in India as the conquest of Kashmir, as the reclaiming Kashmir, as the return of Hindus to Kashmir and ridding it of its quote unquote Muslim invaders and Muslim outsiders. So you have a similar language that we see in many other kind of contexts too, where you have this idea of returning the politics of homeland. We see this in the context of Palestine, where you have this kind of coming together of religious and political vocabulary to justify the kind of suppression of natives and the indigenous people. And we see that in the case of Kashmir as well.
And that Hindutva ideology, action in inaction in Kashmir also is a part of what you have described in the report in the context of cultural erasure. So if a person in the diaspora returned back to, for example, Srinagar or some of the other big cities, what would they see in when if they came across educational institutes that they went to or public spaces that are very core to the Kashmiri identity? Um, Describe what uh, spaces look like now.
I mean, there has been a complete remapping of Kashmir in the past few years. So when I speak to my relatives and my friends, they tell me that, when they look at Kashmir now, and these are people who have kind of lived the other Kashmir as well, also occupied, but the places and the spaces looked Kashmiri and they had Kashmiri names. It was occupation then too, but it was not so manifest. So these people say for them Kashmir is unrecognizable now. So, for example, when they go to any place, it's impossible that there would not be an Indian flag unfurling. It's almost as if the Indian state is trying to convince itself that Kashmir belongs to India. They're kind of being overblown with it because you don't see this in any other part of India. But in Kashmir, it's almost as if they have to constantly emphasize. It's so vulnerable, their control of Kashmir. So you have changing of names of places. So, for example, in Kashmir, we named our places after those people who gave their lives to the self determination movement. You had mohallas, as we call, as in neighborhoods. They were named after them. You had colonies, as in lanes, again, like suburbs and so on. They were named after people who had given their lives to the cause of freedom. But now those schools and those places and those neighborhoods are being renamed after people who the local population sees as its oppressors. So they are being named after military personnel. They are being named after military personnel who are most notorious in the eyes of the local Kashmiris. You have people like Hari Singh, places being named after him, and schools being named after him. This is somebody who all Kashmiris view as one of the most tyrannical person was a Hindu Dogra to have ruled Kashmir. So it's very clear that the Indian state is trying to do two things. It is trying to control and tame and to oppress the bodies of Kashmiris, but it's also at the same time trying to reconstruct the space in Kashmir in a way that when somebody looks at Kashmir, it looks Indian to
Mm.
them. And that's why they are, changing the names of places. And for instance, I have a very close friend who was traveling from Srinagar to this place in Kashmir, this other district in Kashmir called Islamabad. Now, this district called Islamabad, not to confuse it with the Islamabad in Pakistan, Kashmir has its own Islamabad, and this was named after a governor who centuries back uh, was kind of overseeing that particular place. His name was Islam, so
Mm.
that's why it gets its name called Islamabad. So the Indian state, so this particular friend of mine, he was traveling from Sri, and this is a very common experience in Kashmir, from Srinagar to Islamabad, and he was stopped by an army personnel, and he asked him, "Where are you going? Where are you headed to?" And he said, "I'm going to Islamabad." He had him come out of the car, and he was beaten, and his phone was checked, and his he was frisked and searched. Why? Because the Indian state calls this place Anantnag.
Oh.
So this is the state's vocabulary for it. It's this particular word has Hindu connotations, comes from the rule of the Dogras in Kashmir, which was a Hindu dynasty. So they used to call it Anantnag, and it's a punishable offense
To
if you
call.
call it Islamabad. And those people who do call it Islamabad, they face the reprisal then. So this is very common where the Indian state is changing the names of places. You have people like Sheikh Nuruddin Nurani or Sheikh Nuruddin Wali, who we have mentioned in the report. Now, bear in mind, this is not some one of the many kind of Muslim figures or saints. No, this person is considered as the reason for Kashmir being Muslim today by the Muslims in Kashmir. So he is also called lovingly by the people as Sheikhul Alam, which is like the master of the universe, so to speak, or the biggest kind of religious figure, so to speak, of the world. And this particular person was very pivotal and very central to Kashmir kind of gradually, willingly embracing Islam, because he wrote poetry in Kashmir where he introduced Islam to the local population through his poetry. And so the fact that his name is being erased from the textbook is not some kind of incidental or accidental activity. So it's not this kind of some controversial figure whose name was removed. No, this person is very central. He's at the heart of what it means to be a Kashmiri Muslim. And so this particular saint, his name was erased from the textbook for the exact same reason that the Indian state wants to erase the trace of anything in Kashmir, be it people, be it memories, be it places, be it names, anything that challenges India's occupation of Kashmir, and with it, its historiography, its history, its own kind of constructed history of what Kashmir is and what its people are. So, yeah,
This is very, and we live on occupied land, indigenous land. And as you walk around here, and there has been a growing movement of renaming and places to their native. Like I live behind Patapsco State Park, which is the native name for this area. But many years ago, it would have been named under some occupier. And even if you go down to our capital here, Washington, D.C., the state of Washington, all of these are these are the occupier, the generals of the occupation. The whole states are named after them. But native land, it was called and so you see the movement of reclaiming, and as people are coming to terms with the fact that yes, you know, the United States was also formed through genocide and
yeah.
occupation of native land. So I can imagine that is how it must feel for the people there, subhanallah. We're going to and this is something, and we could talk a lot more about Hindutva ideology in Kashmir, and how it's uniquely playing out, very different from the mainland,
Yeah.
because this is, and it's kind of insidious. It's very, subhanallah. But so, inshallah, moving on, I also read that in the report specifically, you pointed out the disturbing patterns of arbitrary detentions under the Public Safety Act, and you mentioned this earlier, the UAPA as well, targeting civilians and activists and even diaspora people who may come back to visit, with targeting them through land grabs. What legal discourse or legal recourse do Kashmiris have in the face of these draconian laws, and how and has anything been done by the international community to address this?
I mean, there are no legal courses effectively, I mean, for the most part, for people who are subjected to arbitrary detentions. And the reason is that the entire kind of juridical or judicial system is built in a way that what it is supposed to do is not to provide justice to the Kashmiri people, which is a paradox in and of itself, because obviously the occupation's courts cannot be the place of justice for the occupied people, because at the end of the day they're extensions of the occupier. So obviously that's why one of the Kashmiri resistance scholars, who right now is in prison, he once said that he cannot distinguish between the bullet of an Indian army man and the pen of a judge who is sitting in the court of, uh, who is an Indian judge in Kashmir. It's because they both perform the same function, which is to justify and to legitimize the oppression that is happening. And what is more insidious and I would say more nefarious about the courts is that they speak in a language of kind of legitimizing. So the military violence is more kind of manifest, right? It's military and it's easy to kind of see. the military, they have guns and they have tools which are there to kill and to repress. I mean, you don't do anything else with it. So they're kind of, it's very manifest for everybody to see. But when it comes to courts, they have this image of being places where, justice is disposed and where legitimacy is granted, where human rights violations, if something happens to you, you can go to a court and get, some relief for yourself. But that's not the case for Kashmiris. Rather, it's the other way around. That courts are essentially there to stamp all these faces of oppression with a stamp of approval. So right now, all the Kashmiri prisoners who are in prisons, they are in prisons using acts and laws that either have been passed in the assemblies of India and then have been vindicated by the judges of India, including the Supreme Court of India. So you have laws like UAPA, for example, which allows the Indian state to detain people, and deliberately the language of law is so vague that under UAPA, a Kashmiri, and I'm not kind of talking from a hypothetical standpoint, these are things that actually happen. Under the same law, you have had a Kashmiri who has been jailed for a WhatsApp status, to somebody who was jailed for cheering for a sports team, to somebody who did protest on the street, to somebody who refused to raise the flag of India on August 15th, on the Independence Day of India. So, all of them, the fact that all of these people, including the resistance leaders who do actually mobilize against the occupation, the fact that all of them were jailed under the same law tells you something about the law,
Mm.
which is that it's deliberately so ambiguous that anybody who creates disaffection against the Indian state is basically a, constitutes an act of terrorism. So what does it mean to create disaffection? Could be anything. It's a WhatsApp status is disaffection too. Throwing a stone, disaffection too. Chanting a slogan, anything is disaffection, right? And what would an occupied population express for the occupier besides disaffection? So it's very important, therefore, to understand that there are no practical recourses to justice that Kashmiris have within the Indian judicial system, which is why it becomes so much more important for one to think outside India and for one to think of pressure outside of India. Because within these courts, Kashmiris go, and all these courts do is that they buy time for the Indian state. So we have had Kashmiris who were jailed for 23 years, 24 years, 25 years, and after all these years, they were acquitted.
Mm.
Imagine being in prison for 25 years and then being told that you can go home now. What about the 24 years? I mean, stole a person's lifetime. So that is what these courts have done, essentially.
So we need to take a short break and we'll be right back. I have one question that I want to ask you as a Kashmiri youth. What do you think are the long-term impact of this cultural erasure, the Indianization of Kashmir? What impact will this have on the next generation in terms of their sense of identity, in terms of the resistance? And and we've seen this in some of these movies that are coming out of Kashmir. You know, when they place have these Bollywood movies situated in Kashmir. But what else are you seeing, and what do you believe would be some of the longer term impact?
I mean, I think part of the answer was actually kind of some people say that it's true that the oppressed, they're destined to be defeated, and the victories for sorry, the oppressor is destined to be defeated, and the victories for the oppressed people. And I'm like, yes, but then I think of the many native people who once owned uh, the lands, and they had their own names, and the places had names that were names that these people had given them. you don't have those people, and you also don't have the names anymore. So I do tell, when I speak to Kashmiris, I tell them often that, sometimes when we talk amongst ourselves, we are like, that's not going to happen to us. We constitute a majority here, and it's not possible. But if you look at any story of extermination of a population, be it a physical extermination or a complete kind of cultural um, extermination, where the place and the people and the names and everything is kind of altered, where it's no longer the same thing. So it has never happened as an event. It's always, this very long drawn process. And so that is something that we fear for Kashmir. And it's very evident when I speak to the younger generation, for example, in Kashmir. So when I was a child in Kashmir, I remember that we would not watch cartoons that were Indian. And it was like I know it's a very kind of small point, but it kind of reflects, how sensibilities change. We would not watch them. It was because we associated them with the oppressor, with the occupier. It was their heroes, and and we would not watch these movies either, because what were these movies? They were basically them shooting in Kashmir as though it's a land without a people, and Kashmiris were either presented, in the background as these, passive people who are just there as showpieces, or alternatively as, terrorists and outsiders and so on and so forth. So we would not watch these movies, partly because we had the sense, but now, this might not be the case with every kid. But now, when I speak to some of these, younger generation in Kashmir, they don't have that strong sense of why they should not be watching these things. Because when they go out, this is what they see in their schools. They are being asked to do plays and to do dramas, and in their books they're reading about these people, the Indian heroes, and what it means to be an Indian, and Indian kings, and all of these things they're reading. And this is the age of kind of socialization. This is where the child kind of tends to understand. And so what we fear obviously is that what the Indian state is now trying to do is that it's trying to transform its military occupation of Kashmir into a proper settler colonial project that aims not merely at controlling Kashmir, but rather at remaking Kashmir. Because with military occupation, there's a sense of temporariness, right? It's like that's how people think of military occupations. It's there until the military is there, right? You remove the military and the people are free. But that's not the same when the very sense of who the people are of this land is not what it was. So I think that is what the Indian state wants to do now. It wants to grant this permanence to its occupation of Kashmir by, and I would end by saying that I was having this conversation with this scholar called Lorenzo Verascini, who is one of the kind of uh, foundational scholars of settler colonial studies. And he said that what has happened now, previously, there used to be a Kashmir and an India, and India used to say that this is Kashmir and it belongs to us. So there used to be a recognition of there being India and there being something called Kashmir, but it belonged to India. And Lorenzo Verascini, he said, now there is no Kashmir, there is India, and that's it. So the idea is that this recognition of Kashmir being something different from India is no longer kind of acknowledged. So now the Indian state is saying, what Kashmir? It's
So
India, and there is no Kashmir without India. So I think that is what we are fearing, is this complete kind of erasure of difference, and the Indian state basically giving this permanence to its rule in Kashmir. But I would like to end also by saying that we hope, and this is obviously our faith, that it's not going to be able to do that, because otherwise, why have people given all these sacrifices?
prices, definitely. Well, thank you for your work and your insightful responses. Um, For those who have been watching and would like to read the report, please click on the link below in the description, and you will be able to download the report from there and read the various key recommendations from this report for the United Nations, the United States, and Canadian governments and civil society groups. And we are, thank you once again for your time, Ahmed, and for your invaluable work that Justice for All you do for Justice for All, and documenting these violations. To our viewers, the situation in Kashmir requires urgent international attention. We can't, as an international community, normalize the occupation, normalize what is happening on the ground. And your support truly can make a difference. Speak about Kashmir, express solidarity on this day with Kashmiri families around you. Seek them out in your communities, and let your elected officials know that you haven't forgotten about Kashmir. Please stay tuned for more updates, and remember, justice for Kashmir is justice for all. Um, Thank you for joining us on today's Justice for All Now show and on this insightful discussion on human rights in Kashmir. I hope we've provided you with new perspectives and deeper insights. A special thanks to our producer Asim Amin and production assistant Sarah Karachirawala. And remember to stay informed, stay engaged, and continue advocating for justice. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you. We appreciate your continued support. If you found today's show meaningful, please consider donating at www.justiceforall.donate. Assalamu alaikum.